The impetus behind this was the fundamental that pediatric EEG is absolutely different than adult EEG. And we all know this, and when we come up against it and you don't have a lot of practice in it, it can be kind of daunting. And so my hopes in the simplest sense are to endow people who don't know the in and outs of pediatric EEGs the ability to read them and discern abnormal from neurotypical. But then, because the conference program said I would do this, I will weave in a little bit of developmental trauma content that will hopefully be a nice segue for Jay later when he gets into his trauma stuff. And so we're going to start out with conception. And at the point of conception, the strategy of the genes is encoded. And we are strategic in the way that neurons grab onto glia and build long fibrous white matter tracts that are the resting state networks of the brain, right? And so the brain runs, nothing random, nothing arbitrary, and it generates millions and millions of neurons. Oh, I'm worried that my video won't work. Let's just see. Maybe it'll work on this side. There we go. And so it's a miraculous trek. It's an odyssey that begins in the very first weeks of life, where these neurons, like I said, grab onto glia like guide wire, and these build these long fibrous white matter tracts that are the resting state networks of the brain. And this becomes the fundamental architecture of the connectome. And the connectome is built by rewiring, reweighting, rebalancing, and all of that shifting in the fundamentals of who we are is based upon the dynamics of not just nature and genetics, but also nurture. And so by the first trimester, the reptilian brain is fully formed. And as we know, it's going to control all of these unconscious autonomic processes in the body. We have the afferent neurons that ascend up to the brain from the sensory pathways of the body, and then we have the efferent neurons that descend. I think I have to do the videos on that side. That's going to be tricky. The efferent neurons that descend from the brain down into the body. And so this is a 3-month-old Theodore, and you can see his heart beating and going up to the brain from that very first fundamental anatomy of the heart. And so by the 24th week, the limbic structures of the brain are fully formed. And this is something that's pretty easy to remember, right? The first trimester, we have the reptilian brain. By the second trimester, we're going to have the old mammalian brain, or the limbic structures. And the proliferation of the limbic structures are going to create the higher frequencies of theta and of alpha in the brain. And so at this point, the vital organs of the fetus are well formed. The lungs are prepared to fill with air. And there's 2 million connections from neurons crisscrossing every second. So early on, we have about 500,000 neurons coming in every minute, right? And ultimately, what the human will have is 80 to 100 billion neurons in their brain. But the neurons born in fetal life will never turn over. They never die. They never degrade. And so it's phenomenal. I mean, if you think about it, what we have is the realm of pure potentiality that's available to us right out the gate. And of course, life takes its course, and there are all types of things that are going to create pathologies. In the second trimester, if we don't see the bumps and the grooves of the brain, the sulci and the gyri form, then you'll get a condition called lissencephaly. Another pathology that would occur at this point, if things don't go as planned, would cause something like microcephaly, right? So disruption here at the earliest stages is survivable, but usually can result in something quite extreme in terms of pathology if the fetus survives. So when it comes to birth, there's a lot of literature. I could give a whole lecture on this, and Rusty, I'm assuming, is the expert in the room on this, but premature birth. And premature births are before full term. I've read 34 weeks, but full term is 37 weeks, when I gave birth at least. And so this is called a continuous EEG and a discontinuous EEG. It has another term, which is trace alternate. And what pediatric neurologists measure is conceptual age, right? So a baby who's born at 34 weeks would have a conceptual age of 34 weeks, right? As opposed to week 1 from full term. And so if we see a baby born prematurely before 31 weeks, we're going to see this discontinuous pattern with bursts and flattened periods. So this is a neonatal at 27 weeks. I didn't take this because I don't get many premature babies. In fact, I haven't seen one in my practice yet. But that's actually normal, right? So it shouldn't alarm. And this is a pretty decent slide that shows visually what you would expect to see in premature babies, right? And so we have awake, eyes open, active sleep, eyes closed, and then quiet sleep. Each week we're going to see an incremental change in what's occurring in the baby, right? You can see the speeding up of the rhythmic frequencies, although rhythm is not quite present in kids this young, but we'll call them rhythmic for the sake of the slide. Theta and delta, theta and alpha at 37 to 40 weeks with slow wave sleep. And then at 44 to 46 weeks, we start seeing spindles. And so this is one of the phenomena that is absolutely fundamental in understanding pediatric EEG, and it's understanding states of vigilance and the shifting vigilance that occurs developmentally, right? And so you'll get this information as we move through this PowerPoint, this presentation. Now, most of you know, but I bet some of you don't know. And so for those of you who don't know, this is the vigilance scale. And this was applied foremost to eyes closed EEGs, developed in the Netherlands, I want to say. It was in Europe. And essentially, we see these things happen when someone drowses, right? Close their eyes, or even with eyes open. Alpha appears in the back, then it appears in the front and the back, and then sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll see it in the front alone. And then we have a desynchronized EEG, a low voltage EEG, and then we start to see them descend down into NREM2, and that's a sure thing when we start to see K complexes and sleep spindles. And so here we go. 36 to 41 weeks, these are some of the things that we expect to see. Turn my volume a little bit. In terms of synchrony, there might be some minor asynchronies present. This is a healthy newborn. This is neodogrus. There won't be a PDR. Temporal theta, we see this foremost in premature babies. So you're not really going to see this in a newborn too much. Drowsiness is going to be something that you can't really differentiate. Sleep, at this point, you're not going to see any vertex waves, no spindles. There's going to be delta and theta activity in all of the sleep stages and quite a lot in the awake stages as well. And then, interestingly, importantly, there will be some sharps, there will be some spikes. Those are normal, those are neurotypical. So, this is a baby sleeping who's a 3-month-old with meconium fluid. meconium in her amniotic fluid. And meconium is, it's the very first fecal matter. It's basically when the baby is consuming all of the free radicals and things in the amniotic fluid. So it's a very black, tarry kind of poo. And when it gets in this amniotic fluid and they ingest it, it's very damaging. And so this mother who came to me said she stopped feeling her baby move right around 40 weeks. And she went to the doctor and she said, I can't feel my baby move. And the doctor said, it's fine, don't worry about it. And then the next day, she went in and she delivered the baby and they found out the baby had ingested meconium. So what's interesting about this is actually the sleep EEG is what you would expect to see. Quite a lot of delta activity, quite a lot of slow. We're going to look at this baby a little bit later. We're going to see some spikes. We're going to see some abnormal epileptiform discharges. We went through a stint at our clinic where we had a lot of babies that came to us who had been drowned. We somehow got on some sort of list, Facebook group of babies that had experienced drowning. And so thanks to Jay, he actually went through a lot of those cases with me. But she was in the same group, I mean, for understandable reasons. And you're seeing her at that moment here, rouse just a little bit with those little beta spindles that roll through. So aperiodic noise is super interesting. It's not something we really study because we study frequencies, right? We study delta, theta, alpha, beta, and high beta. We study the signals in the noise. But the noise is actually one of the more interesting mysteries of the brain that hasn't been really well studied. And I have a feeling that we might be going there as a field in collective. We see aperiodic noise, thank you so much, in all different kinds of phenomena. So I have the Nile here because it is one of the examples of how we see aperiodic noise occur in natural phenomena. It is, for those of you who don't know it, the inverse correlation between frequency and amplitude, right? So what we study, we have the raw EEG signal, this should look familiar, and then we see a spectral display of power and frequency, also should look very familiar. We study the rhythms. We study the frequencies, right? We're looking for that. We think that that's the gold. Aperiodic noise to frequency, or to signal, is akin to neurons to glia. It's that kind of misunderstanding that we currently have, where we used to think, glia, you just throw the glia away, who really cares about that? But it's really very important, and it has all these interesting roles, and the same goes for aperiodic noise. So aperiodic noise is the stuff underneath the frequencies. It's this delicate balance of inhibition and excitation that is the hum of life, right? And so we see this in slime molds. We see it in stock market fluctuations, in weather systems. We see it in the luminosity of stars. And so it's really divine. It's a beautiful phenomenon, and it is that which is underneath the frequencies and the rhythms that we generate. And what's so interesting is that as we age, the noise in our brain gets noisier, right? And so this is an interesting study that basically said, this is Wojtek et al. There's a guy named Bradley Wojtek, V-O-Y-T-E-K, out of UCSD. He's the person that I've sort of looked at a lot for the aperiodic noise stuff. And he said, as we age, all these things are going to happen. This is no novelty. Visual working memory is going to slow down, slower reaction times, there's going to be more variability. In fact, there was a test where the experimenters gave a young group and an old group of people a set of numbers to remember. And then in the middle, for some sets, in the middle of those string of numbers, they'd give a distraction, like the face of a clown or something. Well, it turns out that that distraction really threw the older demographic. They couldn't keep their cool as long as the younger folks. And so we see a much more sloping, a much more sloping, I guess is the word I'll use, noise spectra in younger generations, right? In younger, I shouldn't say generations, in younger individuals. And so what we have here is we have different colors of noise. We have violet, blue, pink, white, excuse me, the gray is white, pink, and then brown. And brown is also called Brownian noise. It's also called random walk noise. And so in infants, we see more brown noise, right? Brown noise is the noise that the brain makes when it's asleep. Pink noise is the noise that the brain makes when it's awake. Pink noise is filtered white noise. And so what I'm essentially saying here is that the older you get, you go from brown to pink to white, right? And this is a wall of noise. This is akin to the static of your television back in the day when you had a knob on your TV and you could turn to channel 14. So it's really interesting because it talks about the plasticity of the individual. And I believe that the older we get, very often the more calcified and rigid we get. And that's, physically, but also mentally. And I think there's a corollary between the two. There's a whole study on something called openness. It's one of the big five in this very popular psychological test. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, and agreeableness. Really interesting. 61 question test. Take it if you have time. Long story short, the more open we are to other people's perspectives, to diverging opinions, the more malleable, I argue, we remain. And the more malleable, the younger, theoretically, we can stay, right? And so on that same thread, when we look at aperiodic and periodic activity in little ones, what we see is aperiodic noise decreases in age with infants. So aperiodic, lack of periodicity. When you're looking at your EEG and you can't count the wavelets, you can't make sense of it, it's a little bit harder to read, you're probably looking at an aperiodic signal, a signal that doesn't have a frequency, it doesn't have a rhythm. It can still be theta or delta, it just doesn't have something that's going to be appealing to the eye. And the older we get, the frequency of frequency increases. So we see frequency more often, right? And this little chart is a Laplacian montaging, and it's showing how we see frequencies occur more frequently as infants age, right? The frequency in the hertz also increases as we age, right? And so if you take a second just to adjust your eye, on the x-axis we have age in days here, and on the y-axis we have oscillation frequency in hertz, right? So we can see that the frequency in hertz increases as we age. That should come as no surprise. And so getting into development and some of the fundamentals that maybe we take for granted, maybe we don't, but in the very beginning, babies and young children are learning through their senses and the integration of sensory input. When this is the domain, of course, of the sensory motor cortex, and the hands and the mouth. I mean, the mouth and the hands are so big, as you know, with newborn babies. That's all that they do, right? Is hands and mouth and hands and mouth. And the parietal cortex is, of course, the integration of that sensation, the temperature, vibration, pressure, touch, all of that. And so that's going to give us an internal reflection of the external world. And then the key sensory input that's coming from your early caregivers is also going to shape your gestalt of the world, of reality. And that's going to be the smell of your mother, the rhythmicity of her holding, the way that she looks at you. Very unique to the mother, right? In fact, a woman came to my house the other day at one of our trainings, and she walked around the house with my baby like this. And she was like Mother Earth. She was so elegant and delicate and graceful and slow. And I'm like a bopper, you know, and pat, 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 but my baby loved it. He was so down. It was really sweet. And so the cerebellum, right, is essential for vestibular functioning, as are many other parts of the brain, the eyeballs, the posterior temporals, the insulae. But the cradling of the baby's head is so natural for most because they're floppy, you know, when they come out. But this is also the part of the brain that can unconsciously sense the neglect of that hand, the absence of that hand, right, in cases where mom isn't present. And so Alan Shore's work is really interesting. He gets into early attachment and the right orbital frontal cortex and how this is hugely implicated in affect regulation and attachment. We're going to be talking about this region of the brain, but I really recommend that if you're dealing with folks that have developmental trauma, particularly if you're seeing it in mood-related issues, you might look to the left or the right orbital frontal, right, Brodmann area 11. What's so interesting about this part of the brain is it's not only tied into affect regulation, but also economy of choice, which is, do I want to choose this or do I not want to choose this? In the most fundamental sense, right? You don't want to pick up the hot coal, but your brain is doing a lot of calculations that will say, you know, why would I want that and why wouldn't I want that and how does that balance out in terms of the economy of my choice? It sounds really complicated, but it's very fundamental. And so when this is affected, as you can imagine, that fundamental choosing for oneself is affected in the individual. It might be absent, right? And so when we talk about things that are absent, one of the key pieces early in life is, of course, this connectivity between mother and child via the eye-to-eye contact, via the eye-to-eye gaze. And we know that when you're feeling engaged and when you're recognizing somebody in front of you, we don't have the presence of something like a mu rhythm, right? And we also have a symbiotic relationship within the vagus nerve, right? And so there's a visceral signaling, there's positive facial expressions, there's an oxytocin thing that's happening both with baby and with mother. And interestingly, when one of us is not okay, mother's not okay or baby's not okay, and I can say it foremost for mother, watching baby. When my baby cries, if he were in the room right now and I was mid-lecture, if he cried, my brain, my executive functioning would shut off. I've tried to lecture through my baby crying and I can't. And it actually goes both ways, right? When I'm stressed or if we're fighting, which is thankfully very rare, my children can feel it and I can feel them feel it. And so I have folks who come through my clinic who don't express developmental trauma from the ACE exam perspective, which I'll touch on in a moment. Most of you know what it is, but who had parents who fought, right? Bickered like cats and dogs in their house all the time. And they have incredible markers of dysregulation that theoretically we could argue were tied to that etiology, to the etiology of violence in the home or fighting in the home. And so eye contact is initially detected by the superior colliculus. It's a part of the brain that means upper hill in Latin, and it has to do with the movement of the head and of the eyes. It's in the center of the brain, and it's tied into, well, it's right next to, I should say, the periaqueductal gray, which is something that Seaburn Fisher and Ruth Lanius spend a lot of time talking about. We're going to talk about that today. But we see these regions of the brain, the amygdala, the pulvinar nucleus, the superior colliculus, and the periaqueductal gray, tied into the ability to make eye contact. And if you find that you have a client who doesn't readily make eye contact, you might see that they avert their gaze. Right? You might see, and this, you'll come across this in individuals who cross your path, but most of you are clinicians, and so you might come across this in your client demographic. And a very powerful quote, and I can't remember if it was Ruth or Seaburn, but they said that their traumatized client said, "I don't want to look somebody in the eyes because I'm afraid they're going to see the stain on my soul." And so there's this fundamental experience of the self as not just unworthy, but like bad. And that's a transmission that occurs, you know, from parent to child. And this is kind of the karmic situation that I think we all sort of signed up for. I mean, at least that's how I romance it and make it okay. But this can be passed on even in terms of the parent that can't look at their child in the eye. Like they can't look people in the eye, and so they carry the shame with them, and so they can't make that direct eye contact. It's just too overwhelming. And if you see this in your patients, you can simply ask them the question, what's it like to look at people in the eye? Right? The client I just mentioned, the one who grew up in the cats and dogs, she won't look me in the eye. It's so challenging. So this fundamental part of the brain, the periaqueductal gray, is a little region of white matter that surrounds the central cerebral aqueduct. And it's responsible for a whole bunch of stuff, right? The regulation of heart and blood pressure, some autonomic processes. Interestingly, it has an analgesic role in pain, which I think is hugely interesting. And it's also responsible for fearful and defensive reactions as well as vocalizations. And so the voice of mother, interestingly, this is one of the regions that it first starts to affect, right? It first starts to pick that up. And here we have another image of that. And in this image, what you're seeing is the pathway for pain inhibition. And so essentially what occurs is inhibition moves through the dorsal horn, through the raphe nuclei to the periaqueductal gray. And so it's rich in opioid receptor sites. It's one of the regions that's going to be really saturated when somebody has an opioid addiction. And it's also one of the reasons why if you have an opioid addiction and you stop taking opioids, your pain sensitivity is really going to go through the roof. And what's interesting about this, and this is going to kind of like flirt with Porges a little bit in his polyvagal theory, right? There's the dorsolateral periaqueductal gray. Let me make this image easier to understand. This is a horizontal slice of the spinal cord moving up as the brain slices shrink, right? And so we have the dorsolateral periaqueductal gray, that pink one, DL, moving up, sympathetic fight-flight. And then we have the ventrolateral periaqueductal gray moving down, parasympathetic, freezing and shutting down. And so that is not the rest and digest parasympathetic. That's the atonic immobility parasympathetic. That is the feigning death or the feigning fainting, right? And that's for a fundamental primal survival reason, right? The sympathetic fight or flight with the dorsolateral periaqueductal gray is a more evolved process. And so this takes me towards this part of the vagus nerve that's called the unmyelinated subdiaphragmatic vagus nerve. And I'm sure many of you know a lot about this, probably more than I, but I can tell you that this part of the vagus is tied into our oldest ancestor, which is the turtle. And if you didn't know that, now you know. That's one cool thing that you know from this lecture, that we came from the turtle. We kind of look like it too. I mean, it makes sense. And so this part of the vagus is that which can allow for the absolute shutting down, right? So in a very simple sense, if you're caught in the jaws of the predator, this is the thing in the rabbit, for instance, that would cause all of the systems in its body to shut down with the exception of its beating heart and the breathing lungs, right? And so it's one of the reasons why with patients who are severely dissociated, we can see catatonic-like behaviors. You can see sort of the deer in the headlights. I believe that, often the true catatonic schizophrenics are that because they were subject to some sort of immeasurable horror in their lives. Sometimes you see it in cult-like abuse, and same with dissociative identity disorder. And there's all these ideas as to what's really happening when multiple personalities are moving through a body. But when you have to leave your body, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And so maybe other things can come in. This is such a very interesting model, and it's worth capturing a picture of. So I talked about the dorsolateral periaqueductal gray and the ventrolateral periaqueductal gray. And so get this, right? So you're in trouble. Something scary is happening and you're freaking out. And so what we do first is we try to run away, right? We go into sympathetic dominance. We try to flee. And if you can't flee, you're going to fight. And that's when the endocannabinoids, which is sort of like the body's natural cannabis system, kicks in. And we move into hyperarousal, hypervigilance responses. If you can't fight and you can't run, you're going to move into tonic immobility, which is the rigid freeze, right? And if the abuse goes on, whatever it might be, right, the torture or the sexual abuse, what have you, then we move into the ventrolateral periaqueductal gray, and that's that atonic immobility, depersonalization, derealization, and then we have that parasympathetic atonic immobility. And this is where we see things like mu rhythm, opioids, dynorphins kick in, right? So that's like the soldier that gets his arm blown off and he's like, I didn't really feel anything, like it didn't hurt that much, right? And that's because your body brilliantly saved your soul and your mind from absolutely exploding, right, in trauma and in horror. But what's really powerful about this is that this, like all things, can create adaptive behaviors, right? We're not here to succeed, we're here to survive. And the brain doesn't throw away anything that works, right? Which is why we've gotten as far as we've gotten. And I have some thoughts on that, but super interesting. So, infancy. Yep, I gotta go over to this side. This is out of Niedermeyer, right? So from 2 to 12 months, we see the posterior dominant rhythm, you might know this, move from 4 hertz at 3 to 4 months and 6 hertz at 12 months. Right? There's a considerable amount of slow activity, right? And it's fairly large in amplitude. There's moderate fast activity, but we don't see low voltage EEGs. In fact, we really don't see low voltage until adolescence. Oh, and that's an interesting bullet. The EEGs continues from the anterior to the posterior gradient. What that means is that I don't think continuous is the right word. I should scratch that. But what we see is it actually amplifies from the front to the back in size, and we see faster frequencies predominantly up front and slower frequencies like theta in the back, or alpha, which is in the theta range. And then around 6 months, the appearance of rhythmic theta starts to show up around drowsiness. And then these are some of the things that start to happen in sleep. And so this is the vigilance stuff. And if you're monitoring babies, then you need to know about vigilance states. And they fall asleep all the time, right? Especially when they're early in. So we see that burst suppression pattern, I guess that's not fair, but we see that bursting flat pattern, the trace alternate disappear. Spindles will appear after the 2nd month, right? Those stabilizing spindles of sleep. We do see vertex sharps and K complexes. Super interesting that the K complex, this is well known, but it first came up because nurses were polite and they would knock on the door, right? And so they started to call it knock wave, and it's also called kappa wave because of the K, because they like Latin words. There's no positive occipital sharp transients of sleep yet. There is 0.75 to 3 hertz occipital activity with moderate fast in sleep. And so if you want to know what it's like to record an EEG on a baby, here we go. Oh, and there's no noise, so you're lucky. Oh, he hated it. And he pulls the ear clip off. No criticism on the electrode placement, please. You just do the best that you can. So I got a 6-month-old on Boomer, and he's 10 months old now, so this is the first one I got. And when you have babies, you think, God, why haven't I gotten an EEG on you? And then you remember, oh yeah, this is kind of hellish, right? All right, so here's Neocosmo. And that means new order or new universe. It's funny. I guess, I hope that this is playing. Yeah. So looking at this is a healthy infant, right? And when I took it, I was hoping it would sort of be like a textbook, gold. This is the example, but it's a healthy infant. We see some occipital sharp waves there, right? And lots of artifacts. There's an occasional spike that shows up, right? But that's allowed. And then this is that little girl that I told you about a moment ago who came through the clinic a while ago. And so there's a heartbeat, right, in this record. Obviously, we know it because it's rhythmic. We do see that she has an alpha rhythm. Let me see if it shows up here. This is her when she's awake. You can see that there's a little spike and a slow showing up there. So thanks to Ron, I now know that I can't say isolated epileptiform discharges, but I can say spike and slow. But this is the baby that is exposed to meconium in the amniotic fluid. And so she definitely had some anomalies in the data. And the doctors had told the mother, this is going to probably manifest as cerebral palsy as she gets older. And there's some phase reversals. And so the reason why is because when we really focused in on these epileptiform discharges, we saw them over the sensory motor strip, C3, which is of course the right hand, and then also moving anteriorly, F3, T3, and that's going to be the mouth. There was someone named Malsby. I was really hoping to see this with Neo when we took his EEG. Basically what Malsby said is, right around the age of 6 months, we start to see something called hedonic theta. And theta is, I guess, a choice term. It's probably alpha, it's sinusoidal. But hedonic theta is what we see in infants when they are nursing. And he thought that this was tied in. Of course, hedonic means pleasurable, hedonism, right? This is great. And he thought that this was tied into eating. But Neo didn't show this. Well, I got his EEG, unfortunately, which is fine. And I have an image there because I'm sprinkling in some developmental trauma. This is Harry Harlow's experiment, his empirical work with primates. This is a classic in behavioral science. To me, it's a little bit upsetting, but so it goes. And so the theory that they were trying to prove was, are babies attached to mother because mother is going to feed them? Are babies attached to mother because mother's comforting? And in these two images, what they found was that the baby monkey deprived of mother would go to the fuzzy, more monkey-like version of, the thing, as opposed to the milk monkey. The milk monkey he'd go to just to eat, but he'd spend more time on the fuzzy mama monkey. And so there's a couple parts of the brain that are uniquely vulnerable, right, in developmental trauma. And the insula is one of them. The insula, of course, as you know, is a pocket of cortical matter. It's when the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe can join, and it's responsible for interoception, exteroception, and proprioception, all of which have to do with how I know myself in space, how my body feels to me, how my insides feel to me, how the outside feels to me. And so it's also, of course, the smooth lining of the stomach and the overall experience of embodiment and of self through body. And so it's interesting to think about this notion of dissociation, detachment from the outside world, not really being confident in self, right, as a consequence of developmental trauma. And so none of this is like sort of, we can't align insular activity with developmental trauma because there's lots of reasons why it might show up. But this is a patient of mine who had this sort of debilitating gastric pain and nausea and panic attacks. She also happens to have paroxysms, right? And paroxysms are tied to panic in the EEG. And then this is another client, and this was actually one that I consulted with Jay on. And what we're seeing is phantom spike and wave at the insula. Very small, but there it is. And I had a unfortunately negative response from the neurologist at whatever it was, UCLA or Chalk, I can't remember which. And to Rusty's point, I mean, it's something to learn from. Not Rusty's, excuse me, Ron's point. Because I had quantitative EEG in the report, they said to the parents, "Oh, this is in the common market. Like this is not legit." And the parents, this is the worst case I've ever seen. This is a 15-year-old boy who weighs 56 pounds. He can't eat. He can't eat. When he was born, he was blowing bubbles out of his nose. His mother knew something was wrong. This is the component that shows this particular discharge, also affecting the rostral and the subgenual anterior cingulate. And so he can't eat because it's incredible, excruciating pain to eat. And now as a teenager, he's not moved through puberty. You know, he has a lot of psychiatric stuff going on as well, right? Consequential to the pain, the intense pain. So anyway, learn from my mistakes there. In developmental trauma, some of the things that we see are poor vestibular connectivity, right? And so what we have here is a simple network that has to do with balance, right? How I know myself in space and how I operate in space. It's the insula. One of the key components of the insula is vestibular functioning, dorsolateral prefrontal, which I call the master of the ship, heavy hitting executive functioning, temporal parietal occipital junction. So we're walking around the world doing our thing, knowing where we are, and it has a lot to do with the connectivity between these three regions. But what we see in people who have PTSD, developmental trauma, there's a lacking in this balance system. It's sort of like, I don't really know what to do with my body, where to go with my body. It's such a fundamental, innate thing if you were raised in a healthy environment and home, but it's actually a lack of confidence of even knowing what to do with one's own body, right? They might seem clumsy, other stuff. And then, of course, the anterior cingulate, right? And why is the anterior cingulate uniquely vulnerable? Well, it's a bit more exposed, right? It's the collar of white matter that surrounds the corpus callosum, that fibrous bundle that connects the hemispheres of the brain, and it can be subdivided. Again, this is something that many of us may or may not know. The subdivisions are responsible for different experiences of emotion and emotionality. And so mood disorders, often we're going to see tie into the ACC, not always. And the cingulate, just like the insulae, both of those chunks of the brain are going to mediate and modulate the amygdala and the reaction of the amygdala. So that makes sense, right? Like, oh, fight and flight are going to be like sort of tethered or monitored by these regions of the brain. So if there's dysfunction in these regions of the brain, we might actually see a more emphatic or unreasonable, fight, flight, freak out sort of response. In fact, there was a paper on borderline personality disorder, and it showed that the white matter in the anterior cingulate was diminished from a volumetric perspective. And if you've ever worked with the borderline, they will give you the finger and run out the door and slam it behind them. Because, right, there's this like terror of being abandoned. You're going to reject me, so I'm going to reject you first. But that's their world. And like all things, they create that reality for themselves. Little blood flow here in cases of abuse. So the posterior cingulate cortex is another one of the vulnerable hubs in the brain. This is important for you to grok simply because when you see people who come in and they rank very high on the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences quiz, you might see some anomalies in these parts of the brain, right? And so this is a part of the brain that has to do with autobiography, spatial awareness, self-consciousness, sort of visualizing a mental operation and succeeding. And so I've mentioned the ACE exam. It's a 10-question exam. If you don't know what it is, Google it online. It's a PDF. You should administer it to every patient who comes through your doors, right? Because then you can say, did you have any of these 10 things? And they are verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Was there violence in your home? Was your mother abused? Was somebody imprisoned? Did your parents use drugs? And there's 3 more, but were you neglected? It's not that straight. It's the questions are a little bit more finessed, but these are some really important charts, and I've put them up because there's not one pattern for developmental trauma. It's not like, oh, you got that thing and that's the developmental trauma thing. developmental trauma is going to manifest in a whole host of different disorders, right? And so the ACE is a scale of 1 to 10. The number is a 4. And when you hit a 4, if you get 4 of those categories a yes, then the chances of you having chronic depression are so much more elevated. Same with alcoholism, suicide attempts, impaired worker performance, needle drug users, homelessness, short life expectancy, and on and on and on and on. So there's not one pattern for trauma. But one of the things that's seen in PTSD survivors is that they have a different picture of resting state connectivity than the rest of us, right? And so the regions that are involved in emotional reactivity are alive and well and awake when they are in their resting state. And one of the other things, and this is another Lanius tidbit, but there's an impaired switching. And so you know that we move from default mode, chillin', mind wandering, hanging out with yourself, to central executive when something important happens, right? Oh, I got to pay attention to that. Tiff just said something interesting in the lecture that I want to listen to. And so that switching is just a very normal switching, right? From the default mode, salient, central, executive network. And what we see is that people with PTSD get stuck in the default mode when they're engaging in an active memory task, right? So there's more mind wandering. And so you might see dissociation in some of the regions of the brain that are responsible for central executive functionings. Gotcha. So, on to childhood. So, around 3 years of age, we see the PVR bump up to 5 to 6 hertz. Slow wave activity continues, right? And that's up until about 5 years of age. They're going to get a green light on slow stuff in the data. I like to say that a kid's EEG looks like their handwriting. It's just sloppy, but it's okay, right? Because they're coming into development and they're forming all these important neural connections. We do see the hypnagogic rhythmic theta start to appear when they start to get drowsy. And then when they're coming out of drowsiness, we see something called the hypnopompic theta. We see V waves, poorly defined post-occipital sharp transients of sleep, and spindles become centered and symmetrical. They become more well-defined. And so one of the interesting things that you may or may not know, right, is that early in life, it's the right hippocampus that's responsible for the first attempts at language and memory. Right? And then when we hit about 2 to 3 years old, it's the left hippocampus that really starts to kick in for the encoding of memory. And so procedural memory, and this is what Freud called the preconscious unconscious, and I could make arguments against that. But anyway, the preconscious unconscious is happening before 2.5 years of age. And that means that when your baby isn't speaking in full sentences or making more noises, they're not going to have a vivid recollection of that because it's not in the declarative memory system. They can't declare that again. And so the procedural memory is one of the things that's responsible for the extraverbal and infraverbal elements of communication. So those are the paralinguistics, right? The prosodic information, tenor, volume, gait, pitch, facial expressions. And so a lot of times you can't remember what happened before you had language, in part because we're using a non-dominant, part of the brain to recall, but also because we're relying on something called the preconscious unconscious, right? Although it can still affect behavior, and there can certainly be traumas that are quarantined and locked away, right? And so when you think about language and you think about dissociation, Van der Kolk said that the shutdown of language and the weakened cognitive processing is an evolutionary response to dissociation. And we know, right, that when we're exposed to high amounts of stress, we're going to make excess glucocorticoids. And glucocorticoids are tied into a stress response. The hippocampi are the regions of the brain that actually have 2 receptor sites for glucocorticoids. And for that same reason, those memory regions of the brain are more susceptible to degradation. The impacting of long-term potentiation as consequential to being in a stressful environment. And so the thesis there is the more exposed to stress you are, the more likely you are to have a crappy memory, right? You're going to have a harder time with recall. That is, unless the stressful stimulus is removed. And if it's removed, then your brain can repair. But if it's not removed and you're in a prolonged period of stress, you're going to experience some memory degradation and some atrophy, right, to the hippocampal cortical receptor sites in the brain. All right, so preschool. This is Theodore talking. This is just recent. You can't hear him, unfortunately, but that's okay because he can listen to me. And so right around this age, we see the alpha speed up from about 6 to 8 to 7 to 9. Things are going to start to look a little bit easier to read. You're going to see more rhythmic activity, less aperiodic activity. Low voltage is going to be a rare phenomenon, but it will still show up. And the drowsiness that is rhythmic theta will vanish. Vertex sharps and K complexes become impressively sharp. That's Niedermeyer's, language. And we still see poorly defined posterior occipital sharp transients of sleep, but we do still see occasional spikes and sharps. So if that comes across your plate, don't freak out. This is Boomer. This was, just a little while ago. You can, eyes open, you can sort of count the alpha, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish, maybe 8. By about 3 years, we should hit roughly 8 hertz. That's, a variable number. The amplitude is quite high. And so there's some lambda activity there, that triangular sharp occipital activity. And there he is. What a stinker. He's such a cutie. And so we know lambda is a monomorphic waveform, shows up in the back of the head, mostly in patients 6 months to 10 years. When eyes are closed, it's called lambdoid. And we also see it in some PTSD cases. So while it's a benign variant, if an individual has been conditioned in such a way that they feel they need to keep vigilance, unconsciously, vigilance of their surrounding environment, you'll see them, shifting, and you'll see their gaze shifting. You might not see them shifting, but you very well might see some lambda activity in the back of their head. Again, this is a benign variant. It's not a great big deal. And so this part of the brain, such a cute little part of the brain, so much smaller in humans than it is in other animals because we're not running from predators all the time, right? But this means upper hill, the superior colliculus, orients eye and head movement, detects threats, detects attachment cues. Right there next to the periaqueductal gray. Not a coincidence. And that was a little bit of lambda activity. I think I'm going to skip past it, but there it is. Y'all know what that looks like. Okay, so when we get into older kids, right, we see the alpha peak mature, usually around 10 hertz. I think boys are a little bit slower than girls. That's been my own experience. And we still see some slow activity mixed with alpha. With drowsiness, now we see that alpha drop out and those low voltage stretches. So right around this age, we start to see that normal vigilance that we're accustomed to seeing. And we see diffuse slowing in sleep. When we still see some spikes, you're still going to see some little spikes and sharps in seizure-free children. So don't let that throw you. And then here's an image of the posterior slow waves of youth. This is 2 to 3 hertz. It occurs in awake EEGs, 6 to 14 years old. Darn it, so I have to come over here to do this one. So watch this little green arrow. And these are shorter seconds, as you can tell, but you're seeing these 2 to 3 hertz little sharps. Nothing to be worried about. Really very normal. And here's a normal 9-year-old eyes closed EEG. Looks very much like an adult, actually. All right, so let's end this with adolescence. So things really start to firm up when we hit adolescence. You see the posterior dominant rhythm mature at whatever it's going to be, 9, 10, 11. There's fast activity mostly. We now see the low voltage really show up as a phenotype just because a lot of that slow has gone away. The white matter's been myelinated. We don't see as much angiogenesis or neurogenesis as we do in the young ones. We have adult vigilance responses that we're used to, and the posts are well developed. Rapid eye movement I didn't mention at all throughout this, simply because it varies so much. But it desynchronizes. We actually see the low voltage pattern of REM. It used to be thought that REM was theta, but that's been disproven, right? And so what we see in REM is that there's that low voltage profile, right? We have that desynchronized EEG. It's mature at this point, but it isn't up to this point, okay? Just so you know from vigilance perspective. And then you shouldn't see sharps and spikes. That's not normal. And if you do, there's a lot of different things that they're tied into, as Jay mentioned earlier. They can be seen in all different types of pathologies, right? So they don't necessarily mean that there's epilepsy on hand. If you need this chart, take a picture of it. It's absolutely fundamental to your practice. Of all things, if you don't remember, anything else that I talked about and all these different things that shift, this is one of the fundamentals when you're working with a pediatric, just to see are they at the normal rate of like their upload download speed for information. I have 1 minute, so modes of dissociation. This is sort of the segue into J. Gating alpha at the right posterior temporal lobe as it ties into the affective perceptual network. We see this in individuals who have been exposed to traumatic situations, and this is a disengagement, right, of the part of the brain that's responsible for perceptual intake, right? It's kind of like, uncle, I'm not going to do it, right? I give up. Mu rhythm is another mode of dissociation. This can be totally fine. It's a benign variant, but this is a kiddo who experienced tremendous amounts of verbal abuse, a father who just projected all over him, all the garbage. You're no good, you'll never amount to anything, blah, blah, blah. So this man had no will to live. Young college graduate, incredibly depressed. And he had a gating mu, right? He had a ongoing mu rhythm in his data, which is it's a disengagement, saying, I'm not gonna play. All right, that's it. That's all I got. Thank you.
Tiff. I've heard a version of this before, and I just want to thank you, as always, for really connecting the dots between attachment theory, the ACEs, and and how all of us, from some sort of infancy, I think all of us, unless we're a robot, but how we can come into life with some of these experiences. But in addition to that, one of my thoughts and comment is that I think many of us may get adults in our practice that say no trauma, no developmental trauma, or they don't rate themselves high on the ACE. Yet, they've been a child of vacancy or absence of some sort of good emotional contact, just by the nature of the parent dyad, right?
Right.
But, further than that, some of my question is, have you ever had the opportunity to work with multiple twins, multiple siblings, and their birth order?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And and whether you could see, as an example, in my case, identical twins, or then triplets, or any other set, right? Like of
Multiples
that are born at the same time or within the same time zone, and how their cues might vary based on the mother's ability to manage more than one.
Oh, I
More than
haven't.
one child.
I haven't, but Jay has twins that he's going to talk about.
Because I'm really interested in, I mean, if anybody else has that kind
I
of data.
haven't. No.
I'm interested, so.
I wish I had a cool answer for you. No, I haven't had twins. And you're talking about the the impact on the mother?
Well, the impact on the child, because one of the things that you're talking about, which resonates for me as a mom and anybody who's experienced mothers, is like how you hold them, and supporting their head in the first couple of years of life, and the smile of mom. But when you have multiple births at the same time, the mom is only one person, right?
Right.
And you're trying to attend to these multiple babies.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Two or more. And so what one child might look like as opposed to the other child as they mature.
No say.
I know.
No say. I don't know. But if it comes across, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Excellent presentation. Loved it.
Thanks, Ron.
I think you should possibly have looked at, or if you still can, your brain and your child's brain as you're breastfeeding.
Oh.
I wonder if you can see a correlation that peak pop up.
I should. You're right. That's a great idea.
Just a thought. It's just when I saw the little baby and you said what he did, I said, I bet it's mimicked.
I bet you're right. Well, something happens. I bet you're right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just a thought.
I'll do it.
Sure.
I'll do it. Yeah. Although that's a little gnarly to hook them up, right? That didn't even have a tip on it. That syringe. It was just the goo. Okay. Thank you.